It's the middle of the night, the 30th of July, 1930. You're standing on a crowded dock in Buenos Aires with thousands of strangers, and every single one of you is about to do something slightly insane. Today, your country plays in the final of the first World Cup in history, Argentina against Uruguay. The problem? The match is in another country, across the Rio de la Plata, one of the widest rivers on Earth. There are no cheap flights. There's no travel package. If you want to see your team play for the championship of the world, there is exactly one way. You squeeze onto one of the boats, sail through the night, and pray. Around you, the crowd is chanting something that tells you exactly how much this means. Victoria o muerte. Victory or death. Not, let's go lads. Victory or death. Now think about what following your team looks like in 2026. Fans hop between 3 countries on budget airlines. They book flights on their phones, land in a host city by lunchtime, and watch the match in air-conditioned comfort. Millions more don't travel at all, because the World Cup travels to them, streamed to the device in their pocket. But for most of football's history, none of that existed. Following your team to a World Cup meant boats, trains, days of travel, real money, and genuine risk. And for thousands of those Argentine fans on the docks that night, it meant something crueler, because most of them were about to miss the match entirely. So how did fans actually follow their team to a World Cup before cheap flights existed? Here's the first thing to understand. For the early World Cups, the traveling fan, this massive, colorful army we take for granted today, basically didn't exist. Think about the maths of 1930. The tournament was in Uruguay. For a European fan, getting there meant the same brutal journey the teams faced. 2 to 3 weeks on a steamship, each way, in the middle of the Great Depression. An ordinary working person could no more afford that trip than a trip to the moon. So the European teams that competed in the first World Cup played essentially without a single supporter of their own in the stands, and the world barely followed from home either. In Britain, the first World Cup passed almost completely unnoticed. No British newspaper covered the early rounds at all, and the few that mentioned the final dismissed it sniffily as, quote, the so-called World's Association Football Championship. The Times of London ignored the entire tournament. As far as most of the world was concerned, the World Cup might as well not have been happening. So who actually filled the stadiums? Locals. In staggering numbers. Total attendance across just 18 matches came to around 434,000 people. That was roughly a quarter of Uruguay's entire population. Imagine a quarter of your country physically attending one tournament. Special trains ran from all over Uruguay into Montevideo. Newspaper reports say some fans set out 3 days early just to make sure they got there. For the final, the stadium gates opened at 8 in the morning, 6 hours before kickoff, and by noon the ground was already full, with over 90,000 inside. Following the World Cup in 1930 wasn't a global experience. It was a local obsession, burning white-hot in one corner of South America, while the rest of the planet barely knew it existed. But there was one group of true away fans at that first World Cup, and their story is one of the greatest and most heartbreaking away days in the history of football. Argentina reached the final, and Argentina, crucially, is Uruguay's next-door neighbor, just across the river from Montevideo, which meant that for one match, and really for the first time, a genuine army of away fans could actually travel to a World Cup final. They came in numbers nobody was prepared for. 10 boats were arranged to carry Argentine fans across the river, sailing from Buenos Aires, Rosario, and La Plata. It wasn't enough. The demand was so enormous that fans crammed onto anything that would float. Tens of thousands of people set out to cross the Rio de la Plata for a football match. The scenes were extraordinary. Fans crowded the decks holding signs reading, Argentina, sí. Uruguay, no. The chant rolling across the water was that war cry, Victoria o muerte, victory or death. The referee for the final, a Belgian named John Langenis, actually crossed on one of these boats himself, packed in among the very fans whose team he was about to officiate, with journalists banging on his cabin door all night. And here's a detail that tells you everything about the temperature of this rivalry. When the Argentine fans landed in Montevideo, the authorities searched them at the port and confiscated their weapons. Depending on which report you believe, somewhere between 1,500 and 5,000 revolvers were taken off traveling supporters. One newspaper dryly remarked, they take great care of the referee in that part of the world. This was the birth of the traveling World Cup fan. Not a tourist with a lanyard, a pilgrim with a pistol, chanting about death, sailing through the night, and then came the cruelest twist in away day history. That night, as the fleet of boats crossed the river, a heavy fog rolled over the Rio de la Plata. Ships couldn't navigate. They slowed, stopped, drifted, waited. One vessel packed with 1,800 fans reportedly never made it at all. And of the 10 boats officially carrying the Argentine supporters, 8 were delayed so badly by the fog that they arrived after the final had already finished. Sit with that for a moment. Thousands of fans had queued, paid, boarded, and sailed through the night, chanting for their team, dreaming of watching their country win the first World Cup in history, and they spent the match itself standing on the deck of a motionless boat, wrapped in gray fog, in the middle of a river, while somewhere beyond the mist, 90,000 people roared inside the Estadio Centenario. They missed everything. Uruguay won 4-2. The fans who had made the greatest away trip football had ever seen stepped off their boats into a city already celebrating their defeat. No refunds, no replays, no highlights to catch up on later. Remember, there's no television. The match they crossed the water for simply happened without them and was gone. It might be the most heartbreaking away day ever, and the aftermath was as fiery as the crossing. Back in Buenos Aires, furious crowds gathered, stones flew at the Uruguayan consulate, and the Belgian referee was hurried to the port under guard, with a ship held specially so he could escape the continent hours after the final whistle. So, let's live it properly. You're a fan in the age before cheap flights. Not just in 1930, but for decades after. Following your team abroad starts months in advance. This isn't a weekend hop, it's an expedition. You save, seriously save, because the journey costs weeks of wages. You arrange time off work, if your employer allows it at all. Your route is boats and trains, days of travel, hard seats, packed decks, strange food, no guarantee of a bed at the other end. There's no booking app. You can't see the stadium on a map on your phone. You may not even be sure you'll get a ticket. You travel on faith. Information moves at the speed of newspapers, so you navigate a foreign country on rumor and broken phrases. And here's the part that's almost impossible to imagine now. Once you leave home, you go dark. No live scores in your pocket. If your journey is delayed, by weather, by a missed connection, by fog on a river, the match doesn't wait. And there is no second chance to see it, ever. The risk you accept when you set out is total. All this money, all this time, and you might arrive to find it's already over. That's what following your team meant. Not consuming a product, making a pilgrimage with real stakes and no safety net. So what changed? The world got small. Through the 1950s and 60s, commercial air travel spread, but flying remained a luxury. A ticket to a far-off World Cup cost more than most fans earned in months. The real revolution came in the 1970s and 80s. The jet age matured, package tours boomed, and charter flights made it possible, for the first time, for ordinary working fans to cross the world for football. Suddenly, the traveling support, the wall of color and noise that defines the modern World Cup, could exist at scale. And then it snowballed. Every tournament brought bigger traveling armies. The Tartan Army, the Orange Wall of the Dutch, Mexico's ever-present thousands, England's traveling masses. By the 2000s, budget airlines and online booking had shrunk the barrier to almost nothing. And in 2026, fans are hopping between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, 3 countries in a single tournament, the way a 1930 fan could barely cross one river. The pilgrimage became a purchase. What once took 3 weeks and a month's wages now takes an afternoon and a credit card, and maybe something was gained and lost in that trade. Today, following your team to a World Cup is easier than it has ever been in human history, and that's a beautiful thing. Millions of ordinary fans get to live moments their great-grandparents could only read about, days later, in a newspaper that barely cared. But think again about those Argentine fans on the fog-bound river. They gave up wages they couldn't spare, crossed water through the night, chanted victory or death into the darkness, and most of them never even saw the game. And you know what? Nobody doubts they were real fans. Their devotion wasn't measured in what they watched. It was measured in what they risked to be near it. That's the thing the old World Cup understood that the modern one sometimes forgets. Football fandom was never really about access. It was about distance, and what you were willing to cross to close it. A river, an ocean, 3 weeks at sea, 3 days on a train. Every fan streaming a 2026 match on a phone is standing, whether they know it or not, on the shoulders of people who sailed into fog just for the chance to hear a crowd roar on the other side. They didn't get to see the match, but almost a century later, we're still telling their story. That's what following your team used to mean.